Hello, Steve Smith here again, and welcome back to another presentation, and this one is about sentence builders. Check out my Twitter there and my blog and informedlanguageteacher.com with research, readings and videos all about language teaching. Now, sentence builders are what have traditionally been known as substitution tables, and they have a very venerable tradition. Actually, I prefer the name sentence builder to substitution table because to me it actually describes better what you achieve when you use one. And a lot of teachers are using the term sentence builder now, and I think that's because of the work of Gianfranco Conti mainly. There's a nice history of this in a blog post by Scott Thornbury, which you can Google, and on the right there you'll see an example of one that was found in a book by Kelly from 1969, and this one was from 1534 for learners of French. And so the idea of breaking sentences into columns and then being able to create sentences by combining the different elements is not at all new. And Harold Palmer, that famous teacher and writer from the first half of the 20th century, British linguist, writer and teacher, he was a big fan of substitution tables. And if you want to read more about them, you might want to check out that article in the EAL journal, which talks more about them. And also go and have a look at Gianfranco Conti's blog, where you'll find various blog posts about sentence builders, and I'll recommend one in particular in a moment. So what is a sentence builder? It's a process, well, according to H.E. Palmer, a process by which any model sentence may be multiplied indefinitely by substituting for any of its words or word groups, including others of the same grammatical family and within certain semantic limits. Interesting that he's using word groups there, recognize the importance of chunking their multi-word units. And when I was fishing around for information on this, here's an example from the ELT journal, 1946, of a sentence builder frame, a substitution table for English. And many of you will recognize that sort of format. And here's a nice definition or description of how they might have been used back in the day. I'm sorry for all the text there that you can see on your screen, but let me read it to you if you don't mind. This is from H.V. George. I don't have a year on this, but I think it must have been in the first half of the 20th century. And he says, the teacher starts by reading sentences from the table, choosing items which are easy to follow, and reading slowly, but without halting at the columns. When most of the items have been used, the teacher increases the speed and begins to take items from widely separated positions. At this stage, the teacher brings out a good student. As the teacher reads, the student points with a ruler at each item in turn. Following is not too easy if speed and range of items increase as the student becomes more proficient. One tries to keep the student under pressure without actually causing them to break down. Of course, the other students are watching to see whether he does, and their interest is maintained. One or two students have a turn, and then a student may replace the teacher himself to be replaced, and so on. I think that was back in the days when only boys were educated, from the way that's worded. So I think a few six would have been useful there. But it gives an idea of, within a very teacher-led approach, how the substitution table could be used to enable students to chunk together sentences. Now, there are kind of two types of these, if you think about it. There are the ones where all the chunks and words are in play, kind of anything goes. So whatever you choose from the column will make an acceptable sentence. And I think most of the ones I see are of that style. But you can design them so that choices have to be made. So certain combinations of chunks from left to right don't work logically. I don't think there's a big problem with that, because it can mean that it can produce somewhat absurd sentences which might be amusing to students. And But you can see also how having some items in play and others not in play does have its advantages, because it forces students to make semantic choices, what works here and what doesn't. But both can be used. And here's an example of one from my French teacher website. And so here we have chunks in French here. Notice the translations are all in, and this was something that's been championed a lot by Gianfranco Conti. And the idea here is that if everything is translated, everything is comprehensible. So students should never have the feeling that they don't understand anything. And that's really important, because as soon as students don't understand, they're more likely to switch off and feel less self-confident about the activity. Of course, you can always remove these at some point, and there may be some classes for whom it doesn't seem necessary. Some high-achieving classes might not need those translations. But so we've got here some time phrases on the left, and then in the middle we've got a verb form, in this case using the first person plural. And it's all about the environment, and in this case there's a grammatical focus actually on the present participle. So for example, we protect the environment by taking the train. So these are quite lengthy chunks, and that's one form which is visually pretty straightforward and clear. We'll talk about design features in a second. And here's a gapped version of the same. So at some point in your teaching sequence, you could choose to use a gapped version if you wish, and of course you can adapt the number of gaps and the style of gaps to your particular class. And next, here's a slightly easier one here, more for beginners. So this is about pastimes, for example, I play, I do, I watch, and so on. There's a choice to be made, by the way, with the translations. Sometimes some teachers like to deliberately use awkward English where the structure between the target language and the English is different. You might choose to make the English resemble the structure of the target language. It's an open question. It's not something I do myself, but it does, if you like, raise students' awareness of the difference between the target language structure and English. So this is just to show you some examples of sentence builders if you're not so familiar with them. Now, how they can be used, I'm not going to go into that in great detail, because to be honest with you, that's been well covered in a couple of posts I picked out for you from Gianfranco's site. You can just Google that, The Art and Science of Creating Sentence Builders. And if you look elsewhere on his site, you'll see ways in which they can be used. And we describe this also in our book, Breaking the Sound Barrier, in some detail. And a nice post by Dylan Vinales, who is a former colleague of Gianfranco's in Kuala Lumpur. And he did a very nice post called Using Sentence Builders to Reduce Everyone's Workload and Create More Fluent Linguists. So you can look that up there. And I think one of the key things with sentence builders, and a reason why so many teachers have picked them up and seem to enjoy using them, is that it does give confidence to students, for reasons I'll go into in a second. But there is a sense that when students work with one of these, particularly with the translations available, there's a sense that, yeah, I can do this. I can make sentences, and I can work beyond the single word level. Now, as I say, I'm not going into great detail, but if you're not familiar with these, the sort of tasks you can use with them, you can read aloud examples, you can do choral repetition, pairs can make up sentences using the frame, you can play read aloud games like Sentence Stealers. Look that one up if you don't know it, it's a very good read aloud game. You can use the gapped version, which I mentioned. Students can make up their own additions in each slot if the class is good enough and want to add their own additions, be a bit more creative with them. You can do simple call and response translation into French or into English if you like. Students could record mini talks from them. And then you can use the sentence builder as the basis for a whole sequence of activities involving narrow listening, narrow reading tasks based on those sentence builders. And you can also push them towards more, if you like, traditional question-answer communicative sequences. So once you've got your sentence builder, you could then imagine conversations based on questions that lead to answers from the sentence builder. So it's a very, very flexible tool. And as I say, if you want to get more on that, go and have a look at those blogs that I mentioned. And in terms of how you design them, I'm drawing here on a blog post, the one I mentioned actually, by Gianfranco here, and I picked out some key points. So if you like the idea of designing them, then I think these are very good principles. So choose high frequency, useful language. So really, chunks that you know can be reused in multiple contexts. That would be the ideal. Make sure they're comprehensible. So to ensure that, use translations. You could take the view that where words are clear cognates, you don't need to show the translation. That's quite possible. That's certainly something I would do. And then, of course, with some classes, as I mentioned, you might want to take away the translations, or even with every class, remove the translation at some point. It's quite a good idea, I think, to use the technique of what's called in the research jargon input enhancement. Essentially, making things stand out that you want students to notice. So that could be issues to do with phonics, like silent letters that shouldn't be pronounced. That's particularly relevant for French. It could be if you want to make certain endings of verbs, for example, stand out, or auxiliaries of verbs, whatever you think is important, or particular spelling problems. So sometimes when I do mine, I'll pick out particular letters that are commonly misspelled. So, for example, in French, we take a word like, let's say, comfortable, spelled confortable with an N, frequently misspelled for obvious reasons, and so you might want to highlight that particular letter to draw attention to a particular area. I think it's important that these sentence builders look clear. There's a danger they can get too messy and overloaded with language, so to make sure that you're not overloading students, then try and keep them nice and clear. Colour can help with that as well. I think it's a good idea, as Gianfranco mentioned in his blog, to avoid putting items together which look very similar. There's a thing in psychology called the interference effect, where if we learn two items that are very similar, they can get confused in memory. So just be careful in terms of how you plan them, that you avoid items that are maybe phonologically very close, or in terms of spelling. You might want to think as well, how do you divide up the chunks here? So, which collocations, which multi-word units go together naturally? What do you want the students to remember? So, do you want them to remember a nice big chunk like Je suis allé au cinéma, I went to the cinema, so they can draw on that from their long-term memory, for example, when they're doing a speaking test. You could consider using pictures, but that can make them look messy, so maybe only use those for the simplest versions of sentence builders. But certainly we know from the research that images can help with memory. And when would you use them? Well, you could use them as part of a fully fledged sort of Conti-style approach, what he calls EPI, Extensive Processing Instruction it stands for, but that's the kind of full Monty Conti approach. Or you could use them as a supplement to your existing practice. So if you feel this is something that you could use as an add-on at some point in your teaching sequence, or maybe at the start of a teaching sequence, then I see that as a perfectly valid way to use them. Now, I'm speaking to you now in 2020. You could be watching this anytime, 10 years from now, I don't know. But certainly there's just in, as I speak, May 2020, a nice new book of these that's come out, written by Gianfranco and Dylan, called Spanish Sentence Builders, and there's a French and German version on the way soon, I believe. But that would give you lots of ready-made photocopyable examples of sentence builders that you could use. And you can also see how they work within a teaching sequence in our book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. So that was just a brief look at sentence builders. If you're new to them or haven't thought through yet, the role they could play in your teaching, and I hope you found that useful. Thanks very much. Do consider subscribing to the channel if you want updates on any more presentations, and do have a browse through the other presentations to see what may interest you. Bye for now.